The winter of 1916 was not kind to anyone on the Eastern Front. The supply lines were broken. Infection was killing men faster than the wounds themselves, and somewhere in a field hospital outside Galicia, a surgeon opened a wooden crate expecting iodine and found honey. He used it anyway. What happened next got written down. Not loudly, not in any journal that made it into the standard histories, but it got written down in field logs, in supply requisitions, in the kind of notes a tired man makes when something surprises him enough that he doesn't want to forget it. If you've worked hives for any length of time, some of what follows is going to feel familiar. Not the history, the biology. Because the biology hasn't changed before we get into what those surgeons found. Take a second to think back on the last time you scraped down a frame and threw away what was on it. Most of us do it without thinking. It's in the way. It slows the inspection down. The hive looks cleaner without it. That habit has a cost. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that cost is. If this kind of history meets hive content is useful to you, consider subscribing. There's more of it coming. Let's go back to the beginning. Not 1916, but further. Honey has been used on wounds for at least 4,000 years. Egyptian medical papyri document it. Greek physicians wrote about it. Roman soldiers carried it. This isn't folk medicine on the fringes of history. This is documented, repeated, cross-cultural practice spanning every major civilization that kept bees. By the time the First World War started, that knowledge was mostly sitting on a shelf. Industrial chemistry had arrived. Carbolic acid, iodine, hydrogen peroxide. Modern medicine had moved on, and honey was something grandmothers used, not field surgeons. Then the supply chains broke. The Western Front ran through Belgium and northern France. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, keeping antiseptics, bandages, and clean water flowing to field hospitals across those distances. Under artillery, through mud, in temperatures that dropped well below freezing, was a logistical problem that never got fully solved. By the middle of the war, shortages were routine. Surgeons improvised. They used what was available, and in parts of Eastern Europe, rural Poland, Galicia, the Ukrainian steppe, what was available was honey. Local honey, comb honey. The kind that came from farm hives a few kilometers from the front. Here's where it gets interesting. Not all of it worked the same way. The surgeons who kept notes, and some of them did, because that's the kind of people surgeons are, started noticing a pattern. Wounds dressed with honey from certain sources healed cleaner, less secondary infection, faster closure. The results weren't dramatic enough to generate formal research, but they were consistent enough to generate preference. Requests started coming in, not just for honey from specific villages, specific farms. In one documented case, from specific hives. Nobody at the time could explain why. Not in any scientific way. But the preference existed, and it got recorded, and it's worth asking what those particular hives had that the others didn't. The answer was sitting on every frame. Brown, black, and resinous, sticky enough to be a genuine nuisance during inspection. Scraped off and discarded by most beekeepers without a second thought. Most beekeepers. Not all. There were army beekeepers on or near the front. This is a fact that doesn't get much attention in standard beekeeping history, but it's documented. Military operations in rural agricultural regions during that period were often accompanied by personnel with practical farming skills, including beekeeping. Bees were a food source, a honey source, and a morale resource. They were managed. Those beekeepers were working hives under conditions that no textbook would recommend. Artillery vibration travels through the ground. It travels through hive stands. Bees sense it. The vibration, the low-frequency pressure waves, the constant environmental instability. Add to that the smoke from fires, the irregular temperature swings of a war zone, the disruption to normal forage patterns. and you have colonies under sustained, unusual stress. Stressed colonies seal everything. This is the piece that most beekeepers walk past. Not because they haven't seen it. They have. Every beekeeper who's worked through a hard season has seen a colony that propolised every gap, every crack, every edge. It looks like the bees are panicking. It looks like excess. It looks like a problem. It isn't a problem. It's the answer. When a colony senses environmental instability, propolis production goes up. This isn't random behavior. This is a 40-million-year-old immune response. The colony is sealing its interior against the outside world, against pathogens, against drafts, against anything that compromises the controlled environment inside the hive. The bees aren't confused. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do when the world outside becomes unpredictable. The army beekeepers near the front had hives that were under that kind of pressure constantly. And those hives were producing propolis at rates that, under normal circumstances, you'd never see. Some of those beekeepers noticed, and some of them, working alongside medical personnel, began making a connection. Here is the part that the history books mostly skipped. Propolis isn't honey. It isn't wax. It's a compound material. The bees collect resins from tree bark, leaf buds, and plant wounds, then mix those resins with wax and their own enzymatic secretions. The result is a substance that is antimicrobial, antifungal, and structurally adhesive. The bees use it to seal gaps smaller than 6 millimeters. Anything larger they fill with comb or wax. Anything smaller they seal with propolis, but they also use it for something else. When a foreign organism enters the hive, a mouse, a small lizard, any creature too large to remove, and dies inside, the colony doesn't remove the body. They can't. Instead, they encase it entirely in propolis. They mummify it. They seal it so thoroughly that the body doesn't decompose, doesn't generate bacterial load, doesn't compromise the interior of the hive. That is not incidental behavior. That is antimicrobial containment. The bees discovered controlled embalming long before any human civilization did, and they've been doing it ever since. The surgeons in those field hospitals were using propolis-coated comb honey without knowing what propolis was. They knew the results. They didn't know the mechanism. The beekeepers near the front were beginning to put it together, not in any formal scientific way, but in the quiet, observational way that practical people accumulate knowledge. And then the war ended. When industrial antiseptics came back into supply, when the logistical systems repaired themselves, when iodine and carbolic acid were available again, the honey jars went back into storage. The field notes got filed. The observations that had been accumulating across 4 years of improvisational medicine quietly stopped accumulating. This is how useful knowledge gets lost. Not through disaster, through convenience. By the 1920s, the pharmaceutical industry was expanding rapidly. Sulfonamides were coming. Penicillin was a decade away. The trajectory of modern medicine was pointed firmly towards synthetic chemistry, and anything that smelled like folk remedy, anything that came out of a wooden crate from a farmhouse near the front, was left behind. The beekeeping community didn't pick it up either. The standard practice across most of the 20th century was to scrape propolis off frames and discard it. It gummed up equipment. It was inconvenient. The hive looked cleaner without it. Think about that for a moment. Here is the convergence point, the place where the biology and the history meet. Propolis contains flavonoids, phenolic compounds, caffeic acid esters. The chemistry took until the latter half of the 20th century to properly document, and the research has been expanding steadily since. Antimicrobial activity against gram-positive bacteria, antifungal properties, demonstrated effectiveness against pathogens that are resistant to some synthetic antibiotics. The surgeons in 1916 didn't know any of that, but they were getting consistent wound closure results from colonies that were producing high volumes of propolis under stress. And those results were good enough to generate documented preference for specific hive sources. What those field surgeons had stumbled into, without a laboratory or a chemistry department, was the hive's immune system applied to human wound care. The same mechanism that keeps a mouse carcass from decomposing inside a colony was suppressing secondary infection in wounds that would otherwise have been fatal. Same compound, same function, different context. The hive had been doing this for 40 million years. The surgeons had 48 hours to figure out which jar to use. What this means for a beekeeper today is more practical than historical. Propolis production in a colony is a signal. It's telling you something about the state of the hive, about its relationship to its environment. A colony that is heavily propolising is not malfunctioning, it is responding. The question worth asking is, responding to what? Gap size in the hive body matters. Rough interior surfaces hold propolis better than smooth ones, and bees apply propolis more readily to surfaces that give it something to grip. A well-fitted hive with tight tolerances and smooth lumber will produce less propolis than a hive with gaps and textured interior surfaces. This is not a defect. This is the colony's immune system being engaged. Temperature instability triggers it. Vibration triggers it. Structural exposure triggers it. The beekeepers near the Eastern Front in 1916 weren't managing their hives toward propolis production on purpose. The conditions created it. But the lesson that comes out of that period, the lesson that got filed away and mostly forgotten, is that a colony's propolis output is not incidental. It is biological intelligence. It is the hive telling you, in the clearest language it has, that the interior needs protection. When you scrape that off and throw it away, you're not cleaning the hive. You're removing the hive's answer to a question it already asked and answered. There are beekeepers who still collect it. Not many, compared to the total population of working beekeepers in this country. But they exist. Mostly older, mostly in regions where the old practices held on longer than the catalogs reached. Appalachian beekeepers, small-scale operators in the upper Midwest who learned from men who might have known someone who came back from that war with a different understanding of what a hive produces. The knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It just got quiet. That's usually how it goes. Useful things don't vanish. They get set aside. They wait. The chemistry that those field surgeons couldn't name got confirmed in the second half of the 20th century. Peer-reviewed, replicated, published in journals that use words those surgeons would not have known. But the underlying finding was the same finding they had made in a field hospital in Galicia in 1916, working with a wooden crate and a jar, and not enough iodine. The hive already knew. That's the part worth sitting with. Every colony you've ever worked has been producing this material. Some of them heavily, some of them lightly, and most of us, most of the time, have been scraping it off and dropping it in the grass without giving it a second thought. The next time you open a hive and find a frame edge coated in brown-black resin, heavy, sticky, inconvenient, stop for a moment before you reach for the hive tool. That colony is telling you something. It was telling field surgeons something in 1916, and they listened because they had no other choice. You have a choice. That's worth remembering. If something in this history connects to something you've seen in your own hives, a colony that propolised heavier than usual, a season where you noticed the difference, leave it in the comments. Those observations matter. They always have. There's a related question about which specific hive conditions produce the highest quality propolis, and why the answer has more to do with lumber than location. That's worth its own conversation. Bu aşamayı onaylıyorum musun? Devam edeyim mi?